Before Aristotle Onassis married the most photographed woman in the world, he was seeing her little sister, and letting that sister believe he was going to marry her. So when the wedding invitations finally went out in the fall of 1968, the name on them wasn't Lee, it was Jackie. This is the story of the sister he wanted first, and the sister he married to win. Skorpios, Greece, October 20th, 1968. The island is Onassis's private property in the Ionian Sea, 500 acres of olive trees and steep coastline kept largely off-limits to the rest of the world. Getting there requires a boat or a seaplane from the Greek mainland, which is part of the point. Onassis had purchased it in 1963 for the privacy it provided, the same year he first began to seriously entertain the idea that the right Kennedy sister was perhaps not the one he had. On this particular Tuesday, roughly 40 guests have gathered in a tiny, whitewashed chapel on the island's hillside, the Chapel of the Holy Virgin. The ceremony is Greek Orthodox. Outside, it's raining, steady and gray over the Ionian. Rain on a Greek wedding day is considered good luck, though Kiki Ferruti Moutsatsos, Onassis's longtime personal secretary, who was present on Skorpios, later recalled in a Fox News interview that the rain that day had not seemed to bring the good fortune that Greek tradition promises a rainy wedding. Inside the chapel, the air would have smelled of incense and candle wax, both standard to the Greek Orthodox rite. Jackie Kennedy, widow of the 35th President of the United States, 39 years old, still the most recognizable woman alive, stands in the orange blossom crowns exchanged in the ceremony beside Aristotle Onassis, 62, a man whose commercial shipping fleet of more than 70 vessels had made him one of the richest private citizens on Earth. Her children, Caroline and John Jr., hold candles during the ceremony. Golden rings are exchanged. The couple emerges into the rain, and the world erupts in a way that a wedding had not produced since, arguably, the coronation of a British monarch. Now freeze the frame and look at who is standing just off to one side. The matron of honor is Lee Radziwill, born Caroline Lee Bouvier on March 3, 1933, Jackie's younger sister by 3.5 years, photographed arriving in Greece the day before. She had received 2 phone calls. The first was from Jackie, informing her that she was marrying Aristotle Onassis. The second was from Onassis himself, who reportedly called Lee separately and begged her to attend. Multiple biographic accounts describe her as privately devastated. She came anyway, having apparently decided that absence would be its own kind of statement, and that a Bouvier girl made her statements in a particular register: present, composed, impeccably dressed, saying nothing that could be quoted. She stood through the ceremony. She smiled in the photographs, and Aristotle Onassis, in whose company Lee had been photographed on his speedboat in the Aegean some 5 years earlier, sailed off with her sister on the Christina to celebrate. Lee Radziwill had known Aristotle Onassis considerably longer than Jackie had. By the spring and summer of 1963, while Jackie was still First Lady of the United States, Lee was already intimately involved with him, cruising the Aegean aboard the 325-foot Christina, photographed on his speedboat, appearing with him at the opening of the Athens Hilton in August of that year. Washington Post columnist Drew Pearson had already posed the question in print that summer. Does the ambitious Greek tycoon hope to become the brother-in-law of the American president? According to Vanity Fair's 2016 reporting by journalist Sam Kashner, the most thorough published account of the sisters' intertwined lives, Lee had contemplated ending her marriage for Onassis. The Kennedy family was worried enough about the relationship that they considered it a problem requiring active management. So on the day the news broke that Onassis was marrying a Kennedy, the Kennedy in question wasn't the one who had spent those years in his company. It was the older sister, the famous one. The New York Times ran its headline the day before the ceremony. The reaction here is anger, shock, and dismay. Stockholm's Expressen put it more directly. Jackie, how could you? Lee Radziwill, standing in the rain on Skorpios as matron of honor, said nothing for public consumption that day. She had spent a lifetime learning to say nothing. To understand what happened on that island, you need to understand what had been happening long before any of them set foot on a yacht. The Bouvier girls, Jacqueline Lee, born July 28, 1929, and Caroline Lee, born March 3, 1933, grew up in a world structured by competition. Their father, John Verneau Bouvier III, was a Wall Street stockbroker known to his social set as Blackjack for his deep tan and his roguish reputation. He resembled Clark Gable closely enough that autograph seekers occasionally approached him on the street. He encouraged both daughters to work hard and, in his phrase, to be the best. The problem with that instruction is that there was only one position at the top of it. Jackie was his favorite, and Lee knew it. He favored Jackie, Lee would write decades later in her book, Happy Times. That was very clear to me, but I didn't resent it, because I understood he had reason to. She wasn't only named after him, but she actually looked almost exactly like him, which was a source of great pride to my father. Vanity Fair described the sisters in terms that capture the visual contrast immediately. Jackie was studious, dark-haired, athletic, and reserved. Lee, 3.5 years younger, was light-haired, chubby, mischievous, adventurous. They called each other Jacks and Peaks. They were known in their social circle as the Whispering Sisters, for the soft, breathy quality both shared in the way they spoke. Lee's voice slightly huskier, Jackie's with what Vanity Fair described as the breathy little girl quality of Marilyn Monroe's, which belied her strong intelligence. Their mother, Janet Norton Lee Bouvier, shaped the competition more deliberately than the father did. Biographer J. Randy Taraborelli, in his 2018 book Jackie, Janet, and Lee, describes her as a tough mother who pitted Jackie and Lee against each other, criticized her daughter's weight, and rigorously vetted potential suitors for financial stability over romantic sentiment. The message communicated to both girls from an early age was structural and unambiguous. Security lay in money and in powerful names. The Bouvier family's own money was already depleted by Blackjack's bad investments and heavier drinking. You married well, or you lost ground. They had grown up at 740 Park Avenue, a 12-room duplex, and summered at the family estate, Lasada, on Further Lane in East Hampton. After their parents' bitter divorce, when Jackie was 10 and Lee 7, Janet moved the girls to Marywood, the Georgian estate of her new husband Hugh Auchincloss, a wealthy investment banker whose fortune was nourished by Standard Oil. The material circumstances improved sharply. The emotional competition didn't ease at all. At Jackie's coming-out party at the Newport Clambake Club in August 1947, Lee arrived in a pink strapless dress sprinkled with rhinestones, a calculated move by most accounts to redirect some of the evening's attention. Jackie, who didn't appear to mind, later appropriated the dress for another occasion. That sequence, Lee reaching, Jackie overtaking, would repeat itself at intervals throughout their entire adult lives, each repetition slightly more consequential than the last. Lee married first. On April 18, 1953, she wed Michael Temple Canfield, a handsome book publishing executive with rumored connections to British royal circles. She was 20. She had beaten her older sister to the altar. What she had not anticipated was that within 2 months of catching Lee's bouquet, Jackie would become engaged to the most eligible bachelor in America, John F. Kennedy, senator from Massachusetts, charismatic and rich, and positioned to become something much larger. The wedding on September 12, 1953, was described by the press as the social event of 1953, with an estimated 700 guests at the ceremony and 1,200 at the reception. Lee had gotten to the altar first. Jackie had landed the name. Lee's marriage to Canfield wasn't happy and didn't last. A subsequent affair with Stanislaw Radziwill, a Polish aristocrat who had escaped to London after the war with nothing but his charm and his hereditary title, led to divorce and remarriage. On March 19, 1959, Lee became Her Serene Highness Princess Stanislaw Radziwill, Princess Radziwill, as the American press rendered it. This was genuine European aristocratic standing, inherited through a House of Radziwill lineage, the kind of formal hereditary title that Jackie, for all her grace and growing fame, didn't possess. Leigh had a 17th-century bakehouse in Buckinghamshire, Turville Grange, set on roughly 50 acres of gardens, stables, and a courtyard, an hour's drive from London. She had a handsome house at 4 Buckingham Place, near Buckingham Palace. She had transformed both properties with Italian set designer Renzo Mongiardino into celebrated showplaces that were photographed by Cecil Beaton and Horst P. Horst. In fashion and design circles, she was seen by many who knew both sisters as the more refined of the two, a keener eye, more European instincts, more daring taste. Elegance is refusal, Diana Vreeland had famously said, and Leigh, according to her friend André Leon Talley, had taken it to heart. For a brief period in the early 1960s, Leigh held the grander European name. She had, as Vanity Fair put it, a life that even Jackie might envy. She was living among aristocrats, artists, and international figures in a world built for display and pleasure, while Jackie was managing the protocols of the White House in Washington. Then January 1961 arrived, and the balance shifted in a way it would never fully recover from. Jackie Kennedy moved into the White House at 31 years old, and the shadow that had always trailed Leigh grew enormous overnight. Bouvier cousin John H. Davis wrote in The Bouviers, published in 1969, Jackie's accession to the White House promised to magnify a problem Leigh had had to cope with for some time, the problem simply of being Jackie's sister. Although she was abundantly gifted herself, she had often been obscured by the shadow of her sister's prominence, and now that shadow threatened to eclipse her identity. Leigh and Stas were regular visitors to the White House. She occupied the Queen's bedroom during their stays. Stas used the Lincoln bedroom. 3 Christmases in Palm Beach with all the children. Jackie consulted Leigh on fashion. Leigh was the first to be dressed in a Paris couture house, Vanity Fair noted, and she smuggled Givenchy dresses into the White House for Jackie to wear because the president wanted his wife in American couture exclusively. The sisters remained genuinely close, genuinely collaborative. Their strongest bond, Leigh said in Happy Times, was a shared sense of humor. But Leigh also told a reporter at some point in those years precisely how the arrangement felt from the outside. It's like we're Siamese twins. And she told another, whatever I did or tried to do got disproportionate coverage purely because of Jackie being my sister. She wasn't wrong. She was a princess, a genuine style arbiter, an international social figure. She was nonetheless introduced in virtually every room she entered as Jackie Kennedy's sister. She wasn't wrong, and it didn't stop. Aristotle Onassis had been building his commercial empire for decades. He had made his first fortune importing English-Turkish tobacco, expanded into shipping, accumulated a fleet of more than 70 vessels, purchased Olympic Airways in 1957, and by the early 1960s held assets spanning Paris, London, Monte Carlo, Athens, Acapulco, and accounts in 217 banks worldwide. He owned the island of Skorpios. He owned the 325-foot yacht, the Christina, named for his daughter, which was his primary social theater, stocked with gold-plated utensils for first class, famous enough that Winston Churchill had cruised aboard it. The boat was a floating demonstration of what money could acquire: proximity to world figures, the gravitational pull of wealth so concentrated that powerful people came to you rather than the other way around. By the spring and summer of 1963, Leigh Radziwill was in that orbit. Her marriage to Stas Radziwill was deteriorating. Onassis, for his part, had been involved with opera singer Maria Callas since roughly 1959, a relationship he would never fully set aside. He wasn't a man who maintained exclusive arrangements, and he was, by all available accounts, a man who found prestige inherently attractive. His longtime secretary, Moutsatsos, later described him as genuinely proud of each prestigious alliance he secured in business and in life. Proud in the specific way a collector is proud of an acquisition that confirms his standing. Lee was a princess. She was the sister of the American First Lady. She was real European aristocracy, combined with the reflected glow of the most glamorous address in the Western world. They appeared together publicly at the August 1963 opening of the Athens Hilton. They were photographed on the Christina in the waters off Monaco. The relationship was real enough that the Kennedy family's inner circle was actively alarmed, treating it as a reputational and political problem requiring management rather than a private matter for Lee to navigate alone. Historian Evan Thomas, quoted in Vanity Fair's 2016 reporting, framed the family's anxiety precisely. The 1963 Mediterranean cruise that would eventually bring Jackie aboard was, in part, an opportunity to persuade Lee not to marry Onassis for the sake of the Kennedys. Robert Kennedy, according to Peter Evans's 2004 book Nemesis, called Onassis directly to demand he stop seeing Lee, regarding the liaison as a betrayal of the family's public image. Onassis's reported response to Bobby was crude and unprintable, and he didn't stop. Then, in early August 1963, Jackie Kennedy went into labor at 6 months. Patrick Bouvier Kennedy was born premature on August 7th. He lived 39 hours. At the time of Patrick's death, Lee was aboard the Christina, somewhere in the Aegean with Onassis. She flew from the cruise to Boston for the funeral and to be with Jackie, then returned. In the weeks that followed, watching her sister grieve the infant and struggle through the remainder of a summer that had already been harrowing, Lee did what sisters do. She proposed a solution. "Come on the Christina," she told Jackie. "Come to the Mediterranean and recover. The sea, the sun, the escape from Washington, from the White House, from the weight of being the First Lady in a year that had already broken something fundamental." JFK, when he heard the plan, was opposed. According to Vanity Fair's reporting, the president was worried enough about appearances that he went down on one knee to beg Jackie not to make the trip. Historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. later recorded in his journals the Washington gossip criticizing Jackie for going off on the Onassis yacht. The optics were bad. An American president's wife, recuperating from a child's death on the private yacht of a Greek shipping magnate of questionable reputation, in the company of her sister and her sister's apparent companion. Jackie went anyway. She boarded the Christina in late September or early October of 1963. The exact duration of her stay is disputed across biographies, ranging from approximately 16 days to closer to a month. An AP photograph dated October 3, 1963, shows all 4 of them together: Jackie Kennedy, Lee Radziwill, Stas Radziwill, and Onassis, on the Christina's speedboat off the coast of Greece. The photograph places them precisely in the same frame, in the same water, on the same boat. Jackie's children weren't aboard. Caroline and John Jr. had remained in the United States. This was the widow's voyage, the grief cruise, the thing Lee had arranged to help her sister. Picture what that boat was like. The Christina's main saloon had bar stools upholstered in whale foreskin, the leather of choice aboard, which Onassis pointed out to guests with obvious satisfaction. The ship employed dozens of crew members in white uniforms. At mealtimes, food arrived on gold-plated service. The swimming pool on the lower deck could be covered over and converted into a dance floor in the evenings. Onassis moved through all of it, as though he'd constructed the stage specifically for this audience, because, in a real sense, he had. The yacht was theater. He was the director. He decided who got access to it and who he paid attention to once they were aboard. What happened during those weeks is a matter of genuinely contested record. Mainstream biographers, including Kashner and Nancy Schoenberger in their 2018 biography, The Fabulous Bouvier Sisters, describe Onassis as largely keeping to his own quarters, leaving the sisters' time together in what was essentially a recovery voyage. Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr., who was also listed as a passenger in some accounts, later insisted nothing romantic happened between Onassis and Jackie. The journalist Peter Evans, whose 2004 book Nemesis advances the most aggressive thesis about the Onassis-Kennedy triangle, claims that the cruise marked the precise moment when Onassis's interest shifted from Lee to Jackie, that he fell in love with Jackie during those weeks while simultaneously courting her sister. Evans goes further and suggests an affair had already begun. Mainstream biographers have treated Evans's claims with significant skepticism. What is documented from multiple biographical sources and Vanity Fair's reporting is what happened at the end of the voyage. As Jackie was preparing to disembark and return to Washington, Onassis gave her a diamond and ruby necklace. Lee received diamond bracelets. Both gifts, by any standard, were significant, but they weren't equal, and they weren't the same. The man who had, to this point, been understood as Lee's companion had given Jackie the more impressive piece. No one seems to have recorded what Lee said about the jewelry disparity, or whether she said anything at all. The sisters returned to their respective lives, and 6 weeks later, on November 22, 1963, a gunman in Dallas ended one of those lives and permanently transformed the other. What the assassination did to Jackie's public identity is thoroughly documented and broadly understood. What it did to the balance between the two sisters is examined far less often, and it did something significant. Jackie became, almost overnight, a figure of global grief, mourned and revered at a pitch that placed her permanently beyond ordinary social comparison. The White House years had made her an icon of style and culture. Dallas made her something else entirely, a symbol of endurance, of public suffering sustained with visible dignity. Her image in those 5 years between the assassination and Skorpios passed through something like sanctification. She was the widow of Camelot. She was untouchable in a way Lee never had been, and, given the arrangement of their lives, never would be. Lee, in these years, tried to build something independent of that shadow.
She had always had theatrical instincts, a sense of drama, of presentation, of how rooms should look and how one should move through them. She turned these toward an acting career with a specific ambition in mind. She wanted to be seen on her own terms, as a performer and a public figure in her own right, not as a footnote to her sister's story. During the mid-1960s, she pursued stage roles. Reviews weren't kind. She persisted. In early 1968, she appeared in an ABC television adaptation of the 1944 film Laura, the story of a woman presumed dead who returns to find herself the center of a murder investigation. Lee played Laura Hunt. She was billed, in a detail that landed with its own kind of irony, not as Princess Radziwill, or even as Lee Radziwill, but as Lee Bouvier, the family name, the name that connected her to Jackie. Even her attempt to establish an independent identity was marketed through the family's primary association. The critical reception, Wikipedia records plainly, was hostile. TV Guide's critic gave her the equivalent of a worst actress designation. Town & Country would later characterize the Laura production as the one that would essentially end her acting career. The reviews ran in early 1968. Lee was 35. Her theatrical ambitions were over. Her marriage to Stas Radziwill was deteriorating toward the divorce that would come in 1974. The European social world she had built, Turville Grange, the London townhouse, the glittering circle of Truman Capote's celebrated swans, the interior design projects and the fashion world friendships, continued,
but without the forward momentum that a genuine independent identity might have provided. She was, in the assessment of friends quoted in later biographical accounts, a lost woman in this period. Gifted, magnetic, refined in her tastes, and fundamentally without a purpose that she could point to as her own. While Lee's Laura reviews were still fresh in the press, the year delivered the second Kennedy assassination. On June 5, 1968, Robert F. Kennedy was shot at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. He died the following morning. Jackie was present at the hospital as he died. By multiple accounts, she told a friend in the days that followed, "They're killing Kennedys." The interval between Bobby Kennedy's death and the Skorpios' wedding was 4.5 months. In that compressed window, Jackie Kennedy went from mourning her second Kennedy assassination in 5 years to agreeing to marry a man who could surround her with private armed security. Onassis had proposed, according to reporting by Sally Bedell Smith and journalist Joan Thring, cited in Harper's Bazaar, during a cruise in the Virgin Islands in May 1968. He had made his case partly in terms of protection, a personal security apparatus of approximately 75 men, some armed. It wasn't a conventional marriage proposal. It was, in part, a security briefing. Jackie, as a consequence of remarrying, would lose her U.S. Secret Service protection, trading government coverage for private coverage backed by a fortune of spectacular scale. This trade made a kind of geometric sense that romance alone couldn't have provided. The phone call came in the autumn of 1968. Jackie informed her sister that she was marrying Aristotle Onassis. Onassis, according to multiple secondary accounts, phoned Lee separately and begged her to attend. Picture what it must have been like to receive that call. Lee had known Onassis for years. She had been photographed publicly with him. The Washington Post had speculated in print about whether he would become the president's brother-in-law, her sister's brother-in-law, through her. She had brought Jackie onto the Christina in a spirit of generosity or compassion, or perhaps both. And now Onassis himself was on the telephone, asking her to fly to a Greek island and watch him marry the older sister. The word that appears consistently across accounts of Lee's private response is devastated. Diana Dubois, in her 1995 biography In Her Sister's Shadow, records that Lee felt Jackie had co-opted Onassis, that she had only been trying to do something kind for her grieving sister by bringing Jackie aboard the Christina in 1963, and that this is what it had produced. Vanity Fair, in its later coverage, describes Lee experiencing Jackie's engagement as a betrayal beyond imagination, feeling that Onassis should have been hers, that he had been hers, until Jackie stole him from under her nose. That language reflects how biographers have reconstructed Lee's emotional state through later accounts. It isn't Lee's own documented on-the-record statement, and should be understood as such. What Lee actually said, in direct quotation, came years later in a television interview with Larry King, later reported in Vanity Fair's 2016 coverage. When asked whether she had ever considered marrying Onassis, Lee replied, "Who didn't?" 3 words, delivered with a laugh, after decades of careful editing. Truman Capote, who had watched both sisters for years and was among Lee's most intimate friends, offered his own characteristically pointed assessment. As later quoted by Tara Borelli, Lee really thought she had Onassis nailed down. She pretended to have great contempt for Onassis and the marriage. She wasn't in love with him, but she liked all those tankers. Capote was being wry, as he always was, but the wryness is doing real work. Lee's interest in Onassis, in Capote's reading, was never purely romantic. It was strategic and financial and social in exactly the way that both sisters had been trained since childhood to orient themselves toward powerful men with large names. She wanted the tankers, the island, the prestige of the association, the possibility of what that name, appended to hers, might mean in the ongoing competition that had structured her entire adult life. Whether or not Onassis had made a specific commitment, and the record does not document one, the years of proximity had created an expectation that was real enough to devastate her when it resolved in Jackie's favor.
She came to Skorpios on October 19th, 1968. She stood as matron of honor the following day. She smiled in the photographs. The public reaction to the wedding was immediate and intense, in a way that reflected how thoroughly Americans had constructed a particular story around Jackie Kennedy and expected her to live inside it. The New York Times headline ran on October 19th, the day before the ceremony. The reaction here is anger, shock, and dismay. Few interviewed in city offer praise for Kennedy decision. This wasn't a tabloid. This was the paper of record, and its characterization was precise. Anger, shock, dismay. Not curiosity, not ambivalence, not a mixture of reactions. Anger first. The New York Daily News reported that the Vatican disapproved of the marriage. The Greek Orthodox rite was canonically irregular for a Catholic, though no formal papal decree condemning Jackie personally was ever issued. The myth of excommunication circulated widely and wasn't accurate. Stockholm's Expressen printed, "Jackie, how could you?" across its front page. The Swedish newspaper was speaking for a significant portion of the Western world. Onassis, in much of the press coverage, read as a villain, or at minimum, as an inappropriate sequel to the Kennedy story. He was 62, stocky, heavy-lidded, with a biography that included a 1954 guilty plea and a $7 million fine to the U.S. government for shipping violations, a reputation for operating vessels under flags of convenience to minimize regulatory oversight, and a personal life that had never been organized around propriety. He wasn't, by any conventional American calculus, what the widow of Camelot was supposed to want. He wasn't handsome in the way that Jack Kennedy had been handsome. Not young, not American, not positioned within any of the mythologies that Jackie's public image had been built to inhabit. What he was, as his secretary Moutsatsos put it plainly in her 1998 memoir, The Onassis Women, was proud, genuinely proud of the marriage in a specific way. He had succeeded in getting married and having next to him the First Lady of the United States. Moutsatsos was present on Skorpios. She had watched him in the months leading up to the wedding, watched him give Jackie many surprises, called jewelers to the island to bring the finest pieces, watched Jackie moving through his world with the soft-voiced politeness that Moutsatsos described in detail. Whenever she would call to speak with her husband, she would always ask me if Mr. Onassis was available. It was never, "I want to speak with my husband." Even in private, in the first weeks of the marriage, Jackie spoke about her husband with the formality of someone navigating a professional relationship. Onassis's son Alexander was 20 at the time of the wedding. His sister Christina was 18. Neither had wanted this marriage. Both had spent years hoping their parents, Aristotle and his first wife, Tina Livanos, who had divorced in 1960, might reconcile. The marriage to a famous American widow ended that hope permanently, and placed a woman they regarded as an outsider at the center of their family. As Alexander reportedly put it to Christina, in a line that has circulated through biographies and journalism for decades, attributed most directly in a 2000 Spectator review. "It's a perfect match. My father loves names and Jackie loves money." The quote is Alexander's, documented through subsequent biographical accounts rather than a contemporaneous, on-the-record interview. No single primary source ties it to a specific date, room, or named witness who was present for the conversation. But it appears across enough independent sources, and its framing aligns closely enough with what Moutsatsos and other direct observers documented about the marriage's internal dynamics, that biographers have repeatedly returned to it as a useful encapsulation of how the Onassis family understood what had happened. The son of the groom, reducing the most scrutinized wedding of 1968 to 2 lines of ledger entry. His father loved names, Jackie loved money, a perfect match. That formulation, if it captures anything true, strips the romance out of Skorpios entirely and replaces it with a bilateral exchange. Both parties received what they came for. Both parties entered with their eyes open. Both parties, in this reading, knew exactly what the other side of the transaction was worth. The reading isn't incompatible with Jackie's genuine need for security. The readings coexist.
That is what makes the story genuinely complicated, rather than simply damning. Jackie Kennedy had been given every reason by late 1968 to make calculations of exactly this kind. Her first husband had been assassinated in November 1963, shot in a motorcade, with Jackie seated beside him, her pink Chanel suit receiving the evidence of what a rifle could do at close range. Her brother-in-law, who had been running for president on a platform that many Americans hoped would restore something of what Dallas had taken, was assassinated in June 1968 in a Los Angeles hotel kitchen. She had told at least one friend, in the weeks after Bobby Kennedy's death, that she feared for her own life and for her children's lives. "They're killing Kennedys." As a result of her remarriage, she would lose the U.S. Secret Service protection she had been receiving as a presidential widow. She would trade government security for private security, backed by a fortune of a scale that few private citizens on Earth could match. Professor Katherine Jellison, a historian of U.S. gender and women's history at Ohio University, told Time magazine that Jackie married Onassis so she wouldn't have to worry about money and the physical security of her children. Jellison was direct about what the relationship was. There was a fondness, and I think, respect, between Jackie and Aristotle Onassis. It wasn't a great love story. Moutsatsos, who knew both principles as intimately as anyone outside the marriage itself, described Jackie to Fox News as very smart and very clever. She would wait for the right moment to speak with him about his behavior, Moutsatsos said. She described a woman who had learned, in her first marriage, to look past infidelity, to direct her attention away from what she couldn't change and toward what she could control. Jackie applied that skill with practiced efficiency to her second marriage. 1 week after the wedding, according to Moutsatsos, Onassis had resumed his visits to Maria Callas. 3-4 times a week. Jackie was aware. Onassis' sister Artemis told Jackie simply, "Don't pay attention, because here in Greece, that's what usually happens." Jackie followed that advice, and by Moutsatsos' account, she was not happy. The word Moutsatsos chose for Jackie's emotional baseline in the marriage was melancholy. She divided her time between Europe and New York, spending considerable periods separated from her husband. Onassis complained to Christina about Jackie's spending. Christina lent a sympathetic ear, as she had wanted this marriage to fail from the beginning. Multiple accounts describe an emotionally distant arrangement in which both parties understood what the other was doing, and neither felt compelled to pretend it was otherwise. There is a version of this story in which Jackie Kennedy, having watched 2 men she loved killed in 5 years, made an entirely rational decision to trade love for protection, romance for resources, and the warmth of genuine partnership for the safety of an arrangement she fully understood. That version isn't false. It's supported by Moutsatsos' eyewitness account, by multiple biographers, by Jackie's own documented history of absorbing infidelity without public complaint. The strategic widow, taking care of her children, navigating a world that had proved genuinely dangerous. This reading holds. But it also can't erase what is visible in the sequence of events. Lee first, Jackie ultimately. The man who had spent years in Lee's company had chosen the more famous name, and Lee had stood in the chapel to witness it. Biographers and journalists who have argued that Onassis may have chosen Jackie partly as a final statement about Lee, a deliberate demonstration of where his preferences actually landed when fame was truly on offer, frame this consistently as interpretation rather than documented motive. Vanity Fair's characterization of Lee's emotional experience describes it as a betrayal beyond imagination. The word humiliation appears in Vanity Fair's editorial language around this period. But no available source documents Onassis saying, in any form, that his purpose in marrying Jackie was to wound, surpass, or outmaneuver Lee. What the record demonstrates is pattern, not stated intent. Lee was first in the orbit. Lee's presence opened the door, and when Onassis made his choice, he chose the one whose name the whole world already knew, without any context attached to it. That choice might reflect simple calculation. The former First Lady of the United States outranked a Polish princess by almost any measure of international name recognition. It might reflect genuine attraction that developed separately from whatever had existed with Lee. It might reflect both at once. Onassis wasn't a man who seems to have separated desire from calculation in any clean way. Moutsatsos described him as proud of his marriage to Jackie in terms that made it sound like a business acquisition. He had also, by her account, never stopped being genuinely attached to Callis. He was capable of holding multiple things simultaneously and not experiencing them as contradictions. What is verifiable is the sequence, and what Lee did with it. She came to Skorpios. She was matron of honor. She returned to her life, which by late 1968 meant a life considerably diminished from what it had been before she introduced her sister to the man on the boat. She continued in the world she had built, the Truman Capote social circle, the interior design work, the fashion connections, the art world friendships. Her marriage to Stas Radziwill would end in divorce in 1974, completing the stripping away of the European title she had used to briefly outrank her sister. She built a life that was, by most measures, extraordinary. She was named to the Vanity Fair International Best Dressed Hall of Fame in 1996, was interviewed by Sofia Coppola, photographed repeatedly in apartments that Talley described as edited with consummate precision, attended by a circle of people who understood, per the unspoken rule Talley articulated, that you never brought up her sister in Lee's company. "It's the subject you never bring up," she told Gloria Steinem. At some point in those years, the story she seemed to tell when she wanted to signal something without explaining it. "When I was 7 and we lived in New York, I ran away. I took my dog and started out across the Brooklyn Bridge. I didn't get very far. It's rather difficult to run away in your mother's high heels." She was talking about childhood. She might as well have been talking about the decade that produced October 20th, 1968. The marriage to Onassis lasted until his death in March 1975 in Paris, the end arriving in a hospital after myasthenia gravis had depleted him over months. Jackie wasn't at his side when he died. She flew to Greece for the burial on Skorpios, in the same chapel where she had married him, and then returned to New York. After his death, she negotiated a financial settlement with his daughter Christina, who had regarded Jackie with what one biographer described as great bitterness throughout the years of the marriage. In 1977, the New York Times reported that Jackie had received $20 million in exchange for dropping all inheritance claims against the Onassis estate. This was the financial resolution of the transaction: a sum, a signature, and a clean separation from the family that had never fully accepted her. Jackie moved back to New York permanently, took a book editing position at Viking Press that she would later continue at Doubleday, and rebuilt the public image that the Onassis marriage had complicated. When her son John Jr. eulogized her at her funeral in May 1994, he identified 3 things: her love of words, the bonds of home and family, and her spirit of adventure. He didn't mention Onassis. Her will, when she died of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, made no provision for Lee. The document noted explicitly that she had already provided for her sister during her lifetime. Lee contested nothing. She had been editing her responses to questions about Jackie for 3 decades, and she continued to do so. When Sam Kashner visited Lee in 2016 at her apartment on the Upper East Side, it was April, during the Greek Independence Day parade, an irony that Kashner noted, Lee's first reaction when she understood that the story was about her relationship with her sister was immediate and pointed. "Please tell me this isn't a story about my sister and me. I'm just sick of that. It's like we're Siamese twins." She was 83 years old. Kashner described her as still alluring, still sensuous, her champagne-colored hair immaculately upswept into a regal coif, wearing tan slacks and a white sweater with a high ruffled collar. Her longtime maid, Teresa, had come out of retirement in Florida to help her. She served them baked salmon on a small folding table in front of the fireplace. Lee wore sunglasses at one point when the sun moved brightly across her living room. Truman Capote had once described her eyes as gold brown like a glass of brandy resting on a table in front of firelight. The apartment was arranged with the same precision Tally had described. Everything edited, everything chosen, nothing accidental. It looked like what Lee had always been trying to build, a life that was entirely and unambiguously her own. Lee Radziwill died on February 15, 2019, in that apartment on the Upper East Side, at 85 years old. She outlived Jackie by 25 years. So what does the arithmetic of this story actually yield? Jackie Kennedy won by every conventional measure of the competition that both sisters had been trained since childhood to run. She married Aristotle Onassis in a Greek Orthodox ceremony on a private island, with the world watching in what the New York Times called anger, shock, and dismay. She became, for the second time in 15 years, the most discussed woman on earth. She had the name, she had the money, she had the famous man that her sister had wanted first. The marriage was, by the testimony of the woman who watched it daily from the inside, not a great love story. It was a transaction in which Onassis acquired the name he'd apparently decided was most worth acquiring, and Jackie acquired the security and resources she'd apparently decided were most necessary. Alexander Onassis, as widely reported, reduced the whole arrangement to its essence when speaking to his sister Christina. His father loved names. Jackie loved money. A perfect match. Lee, standing in the chapel as matron of honor, received the cleaner position in retrospect, though it didn't feel clean at the time, and likely never did. She wasn't married to a man who resumed seeing his previous companion within a week of the wedding. She didn't spend 7 years in a marriage that her husband's own secretary described as shot through with melancholy. She didn't have to negotiate a $20 million settlement with a stepdaughter who regarded her with great bitterness. She didn't end up interred in a chapel on a private island in the Ionian Sea, as Onassis was. But she had wanted something in the early 1960s from Aristotle Onassis. The record isn't precise about what he promised, or whether he promised anything explicit at all. What it is precise about is the sequence. Lee's world, Lee's invitation, Lee's disappointment. She had stood in his life first, and then she had stood in the chapel for his wedding to her sister, holding flowers. There is a saying attributed to Jackie Kennedy, widely quoted, reliably apocryphal, and nowhere documented to her in a primary source, that you marry the first time for love, the second time for money, and the third time for companionship. No interview, no diary entry, no named witness who heard it has been identified. The attribution circulates as cultural shorthand for Jackie's supposed clarity about the transactional architecture of her own choices. Whether she said it or not, someone thought to put those words in her mouth, and they have stayed there. They suggest a woman who went into the Skorpios chapel having already done the arithmetic, having already priced what was on offer, having already placed the second marriage in its proper column alongside the first. By that accounting, the sister who won Onassis had already priced exactly what she was getting, and the sister who lost him may, by the same accounting, have been spared it. Two women raised in a 12-room duplex on Park Avenue, taught by their mother that security came from money and powerful names, trained by their father to be the best with only one position available at the top. One man who spent years in the orbit of the younger sister and chose the older, more famous one.
The fairy tale everyone thought they understood turns out, on inspection, to have been something else entirely. A transaction dressed in orange blossom crowns, performed in a whitewashed chapel in the October rain, with the woman who had known him first holding the flowers and saying nothing. If you're drawn to stories that complicate what you thought you knew, subscribe. There are more of them waiting.